Welcome to the Land to Lots podcast, powered by Launch Development Finance Advisors. And now your host, Carter Froelich.
Welcome everybody to the Land to Lots podcast. My name is Carter Froelich, and today I have the great pleasure of welcoming to the show Tim Green. And if any of you have spent any time at all in the great state of Texas doing development work, undoubtedly you've run across Tim Green. And Tim is a director at the law firm of Coates Rose. Tim specializes in the creation of special purpose taxing districts throughout Texas and most notably in Houston in the DFW area. He's worked on thousands of acres of development projects. To date, he's been involved in the issuance of over $15 billion worth of tax-exempt bonds. And we at Launch really like working with Tim because we all have the same type of philosophy in that we work solely for the private sector in matters of public finance. So with that, Tim, welcome. I'd like to kick it off just by asking you a little bit, how did you get involved in the world of public finance in Texas?
Well, that's a funny story because I always tell people, I say, when I went to law school with the idea of being an international corporate lawyer. So I studied international law, corporate law, and federal tax law. And then when I got out of law school, there were no jobs in that area. And so I left my home state of Tennessee, came down to Texas because it was the land of opportunity, and went to work with a law firm that was doing various types of real estate. And in part and parcel to that in Texas, you have to get involved in these use of the special districts and the tax exempt financing. So I did all my studying thinking I was going to be an international corporate lawyer and ended up in a very single state practice involving political subdivisions and tax exempt matters. So none of what I studied in law school really came into play in the actual practice, but that's how I ended up down here in Texas.
What a great state to end up in. As we all know, Texas has got four of the largest and the fastest growing MSAs and largest real estate markets in the U.S. So that was a great choice in ending up in Texas. Why is Texas such a developer-friendly place to do public finance? I mean, we work all over the country, but Texas by far is one of the best places to practice. Can you shed any light on that, Tim?
Well, anybody who follows national politics will hear that Texas is one of the states that just tries to make sure that you have as little governmental involvement and interference with the private sector. It is kind of the land of opportunity. Come down here, you play by the rules. They don't bury you in a plethora of rules, and come down here and produce good things, and good things happen to you. And so we get a lot of people who come from California business-wise or from other states, and they are just amazed at how little governmental bureaucracy we have, how little government interference we have. And they just basically, was what I say, is the government kind of sets parameters and then lets you go about working within those parameters. Now, one of the things that the state did grab onto at a fairly early stage is they dilute the government powers, in that you don't have one governmental entity that has all of the control of everything. And so, we have cities that have a limited amount of power. We have counties that have a limited amount of power. We have school districts. And as part and parcel of that, when it came to providing public infrastructure, the state set up a structure where you can have these special districts. And they did that at a very early time. They did it in really productively in the early 60s. And so they were one of the early ones to get involved in allowing the creation of these very local political subdivisions with very limited powers. And as part of that, it's the what I call the special districts. Some people call them MUDs, and they gave them the power to provide water, sewer, drainage, and roads, and they gave them the power to issue tax exempt ad valorem tax bonds. And so that has been very, very, very beneficial to allowing and expediting land development and keeping development costs for the ultimate consumer down to the minimum.
And as it relates to practicing in Texas, one of the things that we really like, I mean, and you mentioned California. Anytime you're talking with the agencies and jurisdictions in California, the answer is no. And when you're talking in Texas, it seems like, their response is go ahead, move forward. And so it's great. And obviously, the MUDs are a big part of public infrastructure finance in Texas. What are some of the other vehicles that you're seeing in addition to the MUDs that are being used in Texas at the present time? I know you've got a plethora of different types of financing vehicles.
MUDs have been utilized in urban land development since the late 50s, early 60s. And they do about $2.5–3 billion a year worth of financing in the state of Texas. The newest tools that we now have in our toolbox are probably the use of public improvement districts or PIDs, as well as the use of what we call tax increment reinvestment zones or TIRZs, and then along with that, what we call 380 and 381 agreements, which are very similar to the TIRZ. So going back to PIDs, they're probably the ones that are the most comparable to the MUDs, and they really came into vogue probably around 2010, 2012. Started from ground zero at that time, and here we are 10 years later, and they're being used in probably statewide about, I don't know, 25% of the volume of business we're now using PIDs for as compared to MUDs, and I expect that volume is going to increase rapidly, and the gap between the percentage of deals that get done using PIDs versus MUDs, I think you're going to see that narrow dramatically over the upcoming years.
Yeah.
Then on top of that, we have these tax increment reinvestment zones that I think other states have as well. And so people are starting to use those or use those in combination with the PIDs. And so those are probably the latest tools that we have in our toolbox.
And Tim, when we came to town in roughly or to Texas in about 2010, we were really impressed with all of the financing mechanisms that were available, TIRZ, 380, 381, MUDs, and we ran across the PID too, and perhaps we should kind of out or lay out the difference between a MUD and a PID, because for our listeners that may not be familiar with the two. But the MUD, as Tim had alluded to, is ad valorem based. So the developer needs to put in the infrastructure, sell lots to home builders. The home builders have to build the homes and get them on the tax rolls before the MUD can start issuing bonds of any significance. Unlike the MUD, the PID is assessment based. So, in other words, we're issuing bonds sooner in the process off of the fair market value of the land, assuming the infrastructure to be financed by the PID is in place as of the date of valuation. So the money comes into the cash flow earlier. Would that be a fair statement, Tim, related to the PID and why you think, PIDs are being used more because they help finance part of that gap, to bring money into the development sooner in the development process?
Yeah, what I would say is if you had to compare a MUD with a PID, a MUD is a separate political subdivision that is set up, and then it issues ad valorem tax bonds that are secured by a tax levied on all the property in its boundaries. It's also regulated by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and the rules they have require the developer to put the infrastructure in, create a certain amount of tax base, and then issue the bonds to reimburse them. By comparison, the PID is typically created by a city. It is not a separate political subdivision, which is attractive to the cities. It is not regulated by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is attractive to the cities and the developer. And it specifically contemplates and allows the city to issue bonds secured just by the assessments and to issue them upfront and put the money in escrow and allow that money to be used for construction. And that's what the developers find to be particularly attractive. And so those are in my mind, those are the critical differences. And that's why developers have found the use of PIDs to be particularly attractive here in the last 10 years.
Exactly. And then you also had mentioned the TERS. And do you want to talk a little bit about how developers and cities can work together collaboratively to use the TERS to assist in with a PID to finance additional infrastructure? Are you seeing that structure used quite a bit, Tim? And do you think that structure will continue or not?
That's becoming a more and more common structure. So, as compared to the MUDs, what we're seeing with PIDs is the common structure is for the developer to agree to annex his land into the city, which then makes it subject to the city's overlaying ad valorem tax burden. And so, in order to minimize the effect of that, the city and the developer are creating a TERS, a tax increment reinvestment zone, over the top of the property, whereby the city and potentially the county can contribute to the PID financing a portion of the city and county's ad valorem taxes. So that reduces the financial impact of being annexed into the city. And so they take that incremental city and county tax revenue, pledge it to the PID, and allow it to buy down or pay down part of the PID assessments. And so this, again, allows the property to be annexed into the city sooner. The city contributes some of its, city and county contribute some of their tax revenue to the financing. It allows more PID bonds to be issued up front, which is typically what the developer is looking for. And so it makes the distinction between the financing power of the MUD and the financing power of the PID. It narrows it so that you have a comparable tool, yet it is inside the city. So that is becoming more and more of a common tool.
And Tim, that was a great description, and I think it also gets to the fact of how the public and private sectors really work together to use the different financing mechanisms that they have, each to solve their common problem. If I can say that, meaning cities being able to annex property in advance to increase and help with their tax base and their growth, but also the developers then being able to build that infrastructure in a more timely manner through the use of the PID TERS combination. So I think you explained that really well, and hopefully the listeners are starting to get a feel for Texas and how, rather than jurisdictions in the public sector or the private sector at loggerheads, here you see the public and private sectors working together to finance infrastructure in advance of growth. So, Tim, if a client is coming to you and they want to go approach a city about a PID, what are the how do you go about working with them and consulting with them as to what they should expect when they go into a jurisdiction? And let's break it down into maybe a city that has done a PID previously, and then one that has not done, because I'm assuming that the discussion will be a little different under both of those different scenarios.
Yeah, as we've seen these PIDs be utilized more and more throughout the state, every city, when they first do it, is like they're a pioneer. They've got a learning curve, but I would say to a certain extent we approach them the same way. You just have to be more patient if you're the first one coming into the city and proposing this. So usually what the client asks is, well, how long does it take me to create the PID and how much is it going to cost me? So we go through that, and what you find is that literally the PID can be created in 30, 60, 90 days if you just follow the provisions in the Texas law. But what we recommend to the client is that you go sit down with the city up front before you start the process, and you work through the whole financing so that everybody is on the same page from the start, and that way you can go through it quickly, efficiently, cost effectively. And so normally what we do is we sit down with the client, we say, okay, how big a tract of land do you have? And I've created PIDs that are anywhere from 12 acres in size to, I don't know, 800 acres in size. Each one has its own nuances. And then we say, what are you planning to do with the property? The next thing would be, what is it? You need to have looked at the tax structure inside the city, and how much do you think a home buyer or an end user of the property can stand in additional taxes or assessments. And then they need to have some good idea of what their development costs are going to be. And once they package all that together, we kind of look and see what we know about the city, what they may have agreed to in the past, what limitations they may have put on people. And then we say, okay, within that context, let's see what you want to do, Mr. Developer. You want to develop a small piece of property, you want to develop a large piece of property, it's going to be residential, it's going to be mixed use. What are your development challenges? What do you need? How much assistance do you need from the city in doing your development? And then we kind of put all that together in a package, and then we recommend the developer that they go sit down with the city and come in and say, here is the development, here is my vision, here is what I would like to do, city inside your city, and presumably it is something that's wonderful and awesome that the city is going to be enthused about. And then you say, city, I can make this vision come to fruition, but I need your help. And I need your help, not that I need so much money out of your pocket, but I need you to be a conduit to create the PID and utilize the PID financing so that I can borrow money up front for construction purposes at low interest rate, tax exempt rates. And then if you need additional help from the city through the TERS, you say, and I'm also going to need this from you, which would be the city and the county's participation in some percentage to help the PID financing. And so here is my vision. Here is what I think my users can pay in taxes and assessments. Here's the assistance I need from the city. And if we can all get on the same page with this, we can bring this project to fruition relatively quickly. And then you put all that out on the table and see what kind of a response you get.
Yep. And Tim, we obviously we've gone through this a number of different times. And what we do is try to take the developer's vision, your vision in words, and then put it in terms of numbers, meaning a document we call the finance plan. So it's very simply explained to the city, saying, here's our project, here's where we're at, this is what we would like to finance, here's our current tax rate. Here's what our tax rate will be when we annex into the city. Here's what the impact to the home buyers will be, keeping in mind that we want to make sure that we're not putting ourselves at a disadvantage from the competitive supply. And then that's where where we can bring up, to your point, by the way, if we're annexing into the city, because our tax rate is going to be higher, we would like you to help us buy down that tax rate through the TERS. And that's where we're able to quantify. So working with you, we can get all of those deal points into the development agreements and financing agreements we need with the PID and the PID and or TERS. One of the issues that we ran across, Tim, when we were starting the PIDs is a lot of times the cities had an understanding that they may be liable for the PID bonds. Could you talk about that issue? Are cities liable for the debt they're issuing through a PID?
That's a very common question that comes up with the cities and a very common concern. And usually the cities turn to their financial advisors to give them comfort on this. And typically, what I hear the financial advisors say, and I agree, is that typically the PID bonds are issued. The city is the issuer, and it's very clearly stated in the bond offering that the bonds are secured solely by assessments levied on the property, and that no other funds of the city, other than what they collect in assessments on the property, are pledged to pay the bonds. And that's usually printed in big bold letters 3 or 4 or 5 times throughout the offering document. Typically, the kind of people who buy these PID bonds, they're well aware of that, they understand it. And so far, I have seen no issues or no false expectations about that.
One of the other and Tim, that's exactly, yeah, what we've seen as well, and you're right. That disclaimer is all over the preliminary offering statements, and I think it's getting to the point where they realize that now, but it was a big issue at one point. The other question that we get a lot, especially from cities that haven't done a PID in the past, is, "Wow, we're going to form this new, we're going to be issuing debt to fund public infrastructure, and we're going to have to do all of this work, and it's going to cause all this trouble for us." Is that what you've really seen, or how does that work? How much involvement does the city have to get to actually do to administer a PID?
The cities typically have a little bit of involvement when you're setting it up and structuring it, as a city would with any other kind of development that's coming in. And that's probably primarily focused on the land use. There is an industry that has evolved that they call the PID administrators. And typically, the cities will interview and engage a PID administrator, and the purpose of that PID administrator is to manage the PID and its interfacing between the homeowners, residents within the boundaries of the PID, the end users, the taxing jurisdictions, so that the city is not required to utilize any of its staff. The other thing that is specifically allowed under the PID statutes is for a portion of the assessments that are levied through the PID, they can be used to pay that administrator. And so that is typically what happens, is the developer will advance monies in the beginning to pay the costs of setting the PID up. When the city issues bonds, they'll include a portion of the proceeds to set up a fund to pay the PID administrator. And then as the PID assessments are levied and collected, a portion of that goes into a fund which is used exclusively to pay the PID administrator. So other than the learning curve that the city has to go through to get comfortable with it, the costs of the PID are generally borne solely by the property owners and the developer in the PID.
Yeah. So just to be clear, other than establishing the PID, which the city has input on, obviously, the heavy lifting and the actual work is done by a third party, and it's paid for by the developer. So it's not impacting the city's general fund. There are no costs to the city. These are really self-supporting districts, or I shouldn't call it a district, but there's self-supporting financing mechanisms to ensure that the city's residents are not paying for this, other than those residents that are within the boundaries of the PID. Is that a correct statement?
That is correct.
Great, great. And Tim, you've been practicing law for a long time in Texas. Do you have any anecdotes or stories or learning experiences you'd like to share with the audience Uh,
Probably my favorite anecdote that I've used over and over and over again to make a point with new clients or who come see me, or people who are new to the public financing structure in Texas, is I always reach back to a true story that occurred. It started in 2005 when I was sitting in my office and I got a call from a land developer in the Dallas area. And he called me and he says, Tim, I don't know you from Adam. He says, and I've been developing land in Dallas for 35 years, and I've got a tract of land under contract, and I've run all my numbers, and everything works, and it's a satisfactory investment for me. But my real estate attorney tells me I need to contact you because you can give me or explain to me how I can come up with a better infrastructure financing structure, and I'll make more money. So I'm willing to listen and consider this. And I started out by saying, well, you've got a choice. I said, you can either learn this now, as it is just coming to Dallas in a big way, and so you can be ahead of the curve. I said, or you can learn it in 5 or 10 years when everybody else is using it and has a leg up on you, and you're catching up. And he says, okay, well, I'll come meet with me and let's see if we can figure all this stuff out. So he came and met with me, and so we ended up creating a series of MUDs over his property, and he had a very successful development, made a lot of money. And then about 5, 6, 7 years later, I'm sitting in my office and I get a call from somebody else in the Dallas area, and he says, Tim, he says, my family's owned this land outside of Dallas for decades, and it's now ready to be developed. And I've looked at the developments that you and your client are doing, a mile or two away. He says, I know what infrastructure you put in. I know what amenities that guy has put in. I know what landscaping he's put in, what hardscaping he's put in. I know what the houses are selling at. I know what the lots are selling at. And he says, when I run my numbers, in order for me to compete with him on an even footing, I've got to value my land at basically zero. And he said, so I guess I need to utilize one of these MUDs and so that I can compete with him and not have to put my land in the investment at zero. And the point of all that is that there are various tools in the state of Texas that can assist land development, whether it's residential, whether it's commercial, whether it's industrial, whether it's mixed, whether it's multifamily. But these tools are very powerful. They have a great impact on the viability of the development, and you can sit down and make a decision as to which one you want to use. But you've got to have one. You've got to have one of them in order to compete in the marketplace, unless you have a particularly unique situation. And that's why you've got in the state of Texas probably 5,000 of these MUDs created all over the state. You've got hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of these PIDs that have been created. They're utilizing them in conjunction with the TERSs, with the 380 agreements, in order to be competitive in the Texas market. Like I said, unless you've got a particularly unique situation, you've got to figure out these tools, and you're going to use one or a compilation of them in your development. You have no choice.
Tim, that's a great story, and oddly enough, we just had a phone call from a large national developer saying we can no longer compete without using these districts because we're losing out on every large land transaction we go after because they like to use equity, and they're finally getting the religion related to special districts, PIDs, TERS, 380s, 381s, because literally they can't compete. So I think that's a really important point that you made, Tim. Uh, I think we're getting close to our time limit, and Tim, you've put out a lot of great information, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are going to have questions. related to what they potentially could do with their project in the state of Texas. Is there a way that the listeners can get a hold of you should they want to carry on this conversation in greater detail?
Yes, I guess the simplest ways would be you can reach me at www.coatesrose.com. You'll find lots of information about my development group. We have a number of lawyers on our team, who are active all over the state. Otherwise, somebody could reach me in Houston at 713-651-0111.
Tim, thank you very much. And to all of our listeners, I just want to let you know that we will include Tim's V card to our show notes, along with other information related to Coates Rose. And we thank you all very much for listening with us here today. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Land to Lots podcast with Carter Froelich. Tune in next week for the next episode.